Hi guys, I'm Mark Koenigsberg and today is the 8th of April. Bitcoin price is hovering around $7,200. Corona new cases are still increasing, but we have seen a decrease in the rate of new cases in a couple of big countries, a few in Europe and in the East. That trend continues, which may mean that we've seen the peak in a couple of places, at least of the trajectory of new cases. But remember that even if that's the case, we still have to deal with the cases we have, and there is a lag of a couple of weeks before we see the effects of that which has already been transmitted. Today is the eve of Passover, Pesach, the Jewish festival, famously characterized in the Last Supper painting by Leonardo da Vinci, and I think a lot of people around the world know what Passover is. It's a Jewish holiday. We eat matzah, we basically don't eat, traditional bread products, and a lot of jokes around it. And we have a Seder, which is really an extended meal where we recount the story of the Exodus from Egypt, the Jews coming out of Egypt. But, like all Jewish holidays, there is a metaphysical dimension to the day. And every Jewish holiday is characterized by some metaphysical reality that is happening specifically to that day. So it's not just a history. So we are remembering the story of the Exodus of Egypt, which was this great liberation of the Jewish people, the salvation of an entire nation. There was the subjugation and slavery to another nation, a couple hundred years in Egypt, walked through the desert 40 years to arrive in the land of Israel. But what we believe is that the world was created, that these events repeat at a metaphysical level. What does that mean? And this is not going to be a whole religious or metaphysical, kind of live stream. But it means that the energy, thousands of years ago, when this massive exodus happened, and allowed one of the greatest events of freedom, at a national level, in history, is basically the same energy that repeats on this day every year, which means that there is the potential for freedom on Passover and Pesach that is much more than the potential that exists for freedom on other days. So just take a step back. What does it mean? It means that freedom is more likely and more possible and easier to access during the festival of Pesach than it is when it's not Pesach. So that's a great thought, and whether you believe or not in God or in a religion or in Judaism or whatever it is. But as thought exercise, the idea that a day specifically set up for the actualization, realization, appreciation of freedom comes smack bam in the middle of an unprecedented global lockdown, where we arguably on a global scale have never experienced a lack of national or personal freedom like we are now. There are many cases in history where people have been subjected to much worse things, but at a global level, as a society, as a world, as a species, we've never curtailed our own freedoms intentionally this much. So that really brings about a very, very interesting discussion, which is how can this be that this crazy lockdown is happening in the midst of what's supposed to be a freedom, or rather how can one really truly appreciate or try and access freedom when it's being curtailed in such a material manifest way? And the second question, or follow on from the first, is wait a minute, let's define freedom. Before we get too excited and start talking about what freedom we do have or don't have or this, we should actually ask the question, what is freedom? And once we've dealt with a basic definition, then we need to really look at the nature of it in a qualitative way. And I think that as a society we take many freedoms for granted. We misdefine or misjudge what other freedoms are. And I think there is a huge misunderstanding of the difference between national and personal freedoms and the way in which either is achieved. Okay, now let's take the conversation away from other people for a second. Just talk about me and the way that I see it. And by the way, Mohawk styling is definitely happening here. I'll post an update in a few days and every week during this lockdown, and I guess in a couple of weeks we really are going to see which Dr. Seuss character I look like. My kids saw it, and their reaction was that I look ridiculous. So yes. So the first thing I'd like to suggest is that most often the freedom that we discuss or we think about when we talk about freedom are only those things which are externally exposed on us, externally imposed on us, that take away something from us. So, for example, in this corona lockdown, we aren't able to go to a certain place, or we aren't able to gather, So we see that as a freedom that has been taken away from us. Okay, now that's kind of obvious and that's external, but like so many other things, I think that to really access on a deeper level, the beauty and the kind of real, deep wonder of what is freedom, it has to be a personal and an internal journey. So obviously, if you are stuck in prison, it is very difficult to have freedom of movement. No one is denying that. But as I think it was Sharansky who said that he felt freer in prison than he did outside of prison. Or he was freer in prison than most people were outside of prison. Now, obviously, we're talking about two very different things: physical freedoms versus, say, emotional, spiritual, philosophical, attitudinal freedoms. And if you are limited in physical freedoms, that is primary. But whether you are limited or not, the true actualizing of freedom and the enjoyment of that benefit is something that comes from being able to access real internal and personal freedom. And that is something that is a discussion internally. It's really a discussion between you and you, or in this case, me and me. And it's something I've learned a lot about over the last few years, and I'm trying to, really go down this path more. And I'll give an example. We often define happiness or freedom or something like this as lack of pain or lack of discomfort. And it's not. The lack of something bad is not by its nature something good. It's just the lack of something bad. So there not being someone exerting an imposition on you does not necessarily mean that you have freedom. It just means that there is a restriction that is not being imposed on you at the moment. So the ability to have that freedom is a step past neutral. So we have, limited, restricted freedom, no restrictions but no freedom, and then actually the ability to enjoy that freedom. That's from a physical perspective or an external perspective. But my argument is to actually enjoy it and to really take from it what it is in a way that allows you to live free is internal. You see many people who have every freedom that modern society can afford, but they are essentially slaves. They are slaves, to their own emotions, to their own inadequacies, to whatever else, societal definitions. And I want to sit here and talk what everyone's, what holds everyone, because it's different for every person. But my point is that it's generally emotional. For me, a lot of it was attitudinal. Sometimes I get angry. Sometimes I get really angry at things that really shouldn't be. And what I've come to understand is that allowing myself to let go from that level of anger is actually me internally actualizing freedom. So sometimes people are addicted to different things. That is essentially a slavery. And in the story, in the Exodus story, when it comes to the Jews leaving Egypt, there's a great question as to why the Jews had to spend so long in the desert. After hundreds of years in slavery, get on with it, get home as fast as possible. Why spend decades and decades and decades, in this arid landscape? Haven't they suffered enough? And the answer is that like, it wasn't just taking the Jews out of Egypt, it was taking Egypt out of the Jews. Like, if you live in an externally imposed or an internally imposed mindset of slavery for long enough, then even when you're allowed that freedom, you won't be able to be free or behave or think or act in a way that is free, because it's not something you're used to. So my premise here is that freedom is a conscious choice. And if you look at the example of circus elephants, when circus elephants, I know this is kind of like, I don't mean this to be like a preachy stream, this is really just me in the midst of Corona, an excuse to show hair, talk a little bit about Bitcoin, how important it is to learn, and really wish anyone experiencing Pesach in lockdown and on their own, and especially if you're on your own, separated from family, like, I don't know, just happy Pesach. And I don't know how you kind of cope, but yeah, maybe knowing that we're all in a similar situation helps, maybe not, but it's really an excuse to just kind of launch some thoughts and stream of consciousness about the real nature of freedom, and something that I think about. And I'd really love to hear some comments, and maybe get someone else thinking, and maybe get someone arguing with me, and maybe post in the comments below, tell me that I'm talking trash, tell me that you agree. But really, like, freedom is, I believe, a very, very misunderstood concept on many, many levels. If you look at the financial system, what we understood to be freedom is clearly being thrown in our face now. First sign of any sort of trouble, and it's not our money anymore, we can't touch it, this negative interest rates, quantities, all this garbage. But then on a real level, no matter what your circumstance, that internal ability, that internal conscious decision to choose to be free within yourself, regardless of an external circumstance, is, my argument, what actually makes a person feel free. And I don't think that being free is the objective for most people. They may argue that it is, but I think the objective is for people to actually feel free. You want to feel like you're free. You want to enjoy the feeling and benefit of freedom. So if you can make a choice to feel free and be free inside, regardless of whatever external circumstance you find yourself in, then all of a sudden the external circumstance isn't as relevant. Now, in many cases, still has to be dealt with. But again, premise here, Mark premise, crazy, me just talking trash, is that freedom is actually a choice, and freedom is actually an internal dialogue that is had between you, and actually has very little to do with anyone else. So back to the circus elephants. When elephants are brought to a circus, and they are very, very, very young calves, they are tied with a rope to a stake in the ground. And the elephant will struggle and push against the, pull the stake and pull the rope, and will not be able to move. And after some amount of days, the elephant gives up. It understands that it cannot break free from the stake. And then they keep tying the same rope and stake to the elephant for the rest of its life. Now you can imagine like a couple foot high elephant with a thick rope tying it to a wooden stake. Okay, but a full grown elephant tied with a rope to a wooden stake in the ground is a joke. Elephants rip out entire trees. But the issue isn't whether the rope and stake can hold the elephant. The issue is the elephant behaves because the elephant believes it cannot pull the stake and rope. So, on my premise that freedom is a choice, I would say there are two very important lessons from the story. One is that error checking is important, and that from time to time we should revisit previous assumptions about ourselves, or our belief systems, emotional makeups, our stations, situations around us, because things may have changed and we may not have realized it. So that's always good to check historic assumptions. But the second thing is choose to be free. Now, is it easy? No. Is it overnight? No. Does choosing to be free dramatically change your external circumstance or physical restrictions that may actually be present? No. Is it going to give you access to running water if you don't have? No. But I believe it does give some level of peace of mind. It frees up emotional bandwidth, and enhances your emotional constitution in terms of dealing with other things that are within your control. And ultimately, I think it makes you happier. You can be the freest person in the world on paper and feel completely trapped by daily circumstance. And you can be sitting in prison and feel like the freest person in the world. Now, both those examples are not for most of us, because most of us don't sit on either side of the spectrum. But most of us do enjoy some level of national and personal freedom, and most of us do feel free in some way, but are also subject to some sort of burden or, a trap that holds us, some sort of emotional guilt, something we can't let go, some inadequacy, some feeling of need or conformity, or kind of obligatory something. And again, not suggesting ignore everything, but take a step back and sit down and have an honest discussion with yourself, and that is, am I living, or rather, let me rephrase that, what I'm trying and hoping to do this Pesach? And if anyone would like to join me in the exercise, and I'd love to discuss, is with all the incredible freedoms that I've been awarded, and the amazing, amazing, amazing world that we live in, am I living in it as a person that's free, or am I making things harder for myself by not accessing that freedom and believing it first and foremost? So on that note, happy Pesach, Chag Sameach to everyone. Have a great Seder, and if you're alone, just strength and health, and this should all be over soon. And for everyone, remember, learn about Bitcoin, take a few minutes, and hopefully we'll soon see the end of this corona lockdown and a return to a healthy world that has learned something from this pandemic. So learn about Bitcoin. Happy Pesach. Be safe, be strong, be free.